That is not at all how you build software. I mean, successful software. Business priorities change because businesses change. The way that you need to think of web applications is they're like living, breathing entities, just like the businesses, and the priorities need to move with the priorities of the business.
Welcome to the podcast, guys. I'm here with Ksense and Calvin. Ksense is the founder and CEO of Ksense Technology Group, a software company that builds custom web applications for organizations of all kinds. He's a software engineer himself and has built a team that handles full stack web development projects all the way from concept to deployment. Calvin is the COO at Ksense and oversees the systems and processes used to go from an idea to a working business application. He also spends his time understanding the nuances of clients' business objectives and how software features can be designed to meet those objectives. Welcome, guys.
Thanks,
Hey, how's it going?
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking about how to build a successful web application. So that's kind of a broad topic, but we're going to talk about some of the things that you guys have learned in your experience and what approach you take to make sure that you're building those high quality applications that really deliver what people are looking for and solve business problems. My first question is, what are the overall steps? What does that process look like for you guys when you have an idea? How do you get started?
I guess the first step would be discovery, basically getting to know the company, getting to know their processes, getting to know the different stakeholders. Sometimes people have processes that are on spreadsheets. Maybe they're using Excel or Google Sheets. Other times they have, pen and paper in a lot of cases, or maybe they're using some off-the-shelf tools like Monday.com or ClickUp. So we really need to learn about their process and why is it that they're looking for custom software? Is this like what's driving this? What type of problems are they having? That really helps us to start to understand what types of solutions are going to work best for them. And then also prioritize the different features that we might be able to build for them so that we can choose the most important features first and get those built at the beginning of the project, since that'll start paying dividends and kind of paying for, the project as it goes.
Yeah. And once all that discovery is done, which usually, for our organization involves putting somebody who's a business analyst with the client, they're responsible for really doing a deep dive, putting themselves in the client's shoes and really understanding the client's business and their pain points. But then once all that process is done, then it goes to the guys like me and my development team who then answer the question, what's the best architecture that needs to be built? What's the best technical solution to deliver those results and pay those dividends? So you have to have really, the discovery is really the most important part, because without that, you're not even sure you need custom software or not, so that you're not reinventing the wheel. But then after that really important process is done, then it kind of gets kicked over. And that's when you start thinking about the development steps from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about choosing the architecture. What are the indicators to you that somebody really needs to go custom, or which technologies to use?
Yeah, usually people know that they need to go custom when they're doing a lot of workarounds in their current software. They're really trying to push themselves into the software and make it work. And they're doing all sorts of things that really are inconvenient to them. Or perhaps maybe they're using multiple different pieces of software and it's just causing a lot of context switching and a lot of inefficiencies in that process. Usually that's due to their business operation being very different than what these, off-the-shelf solutions offer. And they find themselves in a situation where no tool feels exactly right.
The client will kind of know because they've been around the block a few times and they've tried all these different solutions. And a lot of times, a lot of solutions out there like Monday.com or, some of these solutions that help automate businesses, they do work when you're a really small business, when you can afford to kind of fit your business around the workflows and the tools that those off-the-shelf tools provide. It works at that point. But then when you try to scale, when you need, 50 people or 100 people, or, you need a system that is very, very rigid and does exactly what you want it to when you want it to, you start realizing that those tools start falling apart basically when you try to scale up. So that's when, especially if you're in a position where your business is doing really good, usually a lot of these businesses, they're scaling really well and they're facing operational problems because of that. So that's a perfect time at that point to invest in custom software, because it's going to pay for itself in the fact that it's going to allow the business to scale at that point and go to the next level.
Not to mention, sometimes there is a reason why you would want to switch from a really good off the shelf to custom. And that's when your user licenses are very expensive, where you have 1,000 or 2,000 users and you're paying $200 a month per seat. Then, that's a good time when you might want to start thinking, okay, this works really good for us. And we've already done all the prototyping in Monday. We know exactly how the system works. Let's build something custom. Now we don't have to pay any of those fees. We just have to pay whatever it costs to host this system, which is, pennies to the dollar in comparison to what you're paying for the user licenses.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I've worked with businesses that are really small, all the way up to thousands and thousands of employees. And if your process, if you have to add 5 minutes to your process to go to another system and, grab these details, that's fine when you're doing 20 tasks a day. But then when you've got thousands of those coming in per day, 5 minutes per task really adds up quick. You end up spending millions of dollars per year on those little inefficiencies that you might not have even thought about when you were smaller. Let's keep talking about the process. We get through discovery, we get to know their business a little bit, we get to know what their objectives are. Where do you go from there?
Well, at that point, you hopefully have a good understanding of how the client's business works. I mean, it does take many discovery cycles to really start getting to know the business, which is why what we do is we actually give a single point of contact. We have a single project manager who is dedicated to that client and sticks with them long term, allowing them to learn the business. But at the beginning, you probably are starting to get the hang of how the business works, how you're starting to understand what their problems are. So now it's really a question of, okay, what's our starting point? For some clients, if they need to build a new custom web app, that starting point is going to be, okay, we're going to build a new web app. So the place we start with that is we start with, first of all, identifying exactly what technologies we're going to use. So we'll do a review of the client's needs, and we'll take a look at, okay, what type of reliability are they wanting? What type of, what's the best technology that currently exists to build this type of application? Do we need instant messaging, or like what type of features do we think they're going to need? That'll determine what type of technology we use.
It's really important to pick the technologies based on the need and not based on what technologies my engineers are most comfortable with.
Yeah, then the technologies really are determined by our experience. Since we have experience building so many different apps, we sort of know, okay, we know the trade-offs, right, between a couple different technologies. Like if we're going to use Next.js, our engineers know the trade-offs between, are we going to host that on Amazon Web Services, or are we going to host that on Vercel? And there are different trade-offs with that, and pros and cons. So talking to the engineer, the business analyst and the engineer talking together are able to look at that and sort of make a plan for how this web application is going to be designed from the ground up. So that's the first step for a new application. But what about if they have an existing application and it's maybe it's just it's a legacy app, or maybe it's a low code app or something like that? Well, then we need to make a decision based on what's going to be best for the client and what their budget is and what they want to do. Do we help them triage and kind of fix their current app and try to improve it, which we can do sometimes depending on this, like what type of app it is? Or do we start to think about transitioning them on to another app? So to give you an example, we have a client right now, and they've been using a low-code app for years. And they're a multinational nonprofit. They have thousands of users all over the world, and they're running their entire business operation on this app that's a low-code app. It's actually on the Knack platform. And what we did when we first came in to start working with them is we saw that their app was way too big to try to move it right away. So what we did is we went in and we identified the highest priority problems that they had. And then we started to fix those one at a time. And we fixed a lot of security vulnerabilities. We fixed a lot of broken processes. We fixed their QuickBooks integration so that ran smoothly. And now, after about a year of development, we've gotten to a point where it's kind of running into fundamental limitations of the low-code platform. So now we're in the process of thinking about transitioning them to a custom app. So it's really, every client is different. What we try to do is discover what their needs are and how we can best provide value to them. Can we provide the most value by fixing their current app, or can we provide more value by moving them to a custom solution?
Makes sense. It's always different, right? All kinds of different needs and different objectives depending on the client you're working with and the scale that they need in their application. What are the common things that you see across pretty much all of your projects?
Well, some of the most common things are that people have a lot of business data that oftentimes is decentralized, meaning they have all their data, half of it's over here in this system, half of it's over here in this system. And really what they would like is for all that data to be in one place so that that data can be up to date, so that that data can be accurate, and so that they can actually look at that data and maybe visualize it to actually help them make decisions. Problem is it's often separated into multiple systems. So that's a huge common thread, is centralizing the data so that the business can make sure there's a single source of truth and that that is accurate data that they can visualize and use. And then as far as applications go, usually what we're working on are applications that are business-focused applications to help businesses improve their operations. So there actually are a lot of different variations of that, but you have your different parts of a web application that are pretty common, like user management. People need to be able to manage users. There need to be different roles so that they can give people the right permissions for what they need to do. And there's usually some element of CRUD operation in the apps we build. So that's create, read, update, and delete. So basically we are building an app to manage data fundamentally. So that's usually what I'm seeing as the most common types of apps that we're looking at.
Yeah, like Calvin said, it's a lot of CRUD operations, which is what you'd expect from business web applications for the most part.
Keeping track of employee records and updating or deleting those employees, or, inventory, all kinds of things like that. Very cool.
And what happens a lot of the times is it's, at the abstract level, it's a little hard to imagine what these apps kind of look like and what the planning process looks like. But think of it like this. You have a business and there are all these workflows that the people in that business have to do every day. For one of our clients, they need to onboard new users, new auditors into their app. They also need to do background checks on users. So there's all these individual workflows that they need to do. And the goal of the app is to streamline that so it's super easy, and so that they can go in and they have exactly what they need to perform their workflow. And that's really what a custom system is designed to do, is to streamline your workflow and centralize your data in one place.
Right. Do you guys ever run into issues with people figuring out what their objectives are, or even having conflicts within their own team about what should be the priority?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that before. One example that I remember is we had a company who wanted to build a platform where they basically had lawyers who were on one side of the platform, and then they had customers who wanted to hire those lawyers to do certain contracts or certain things like that for them. I think it was patents, a lot of patents that they wanted to do. So the CEO of the company had a different idea of what these features should look like and how they should work than the person that we were kind of working with, which was like their project manager. So it is important, especially from a business perspective, when you're looking at building one of these apps, the person that should have the say in how it works is the person who's actually going to use it the most. So in this case, the CEO was actually doing a lot of the day-to-day tasks. So she actually ended up having a really good understanding of what was needed. The project manager had less of an understanding because he wasn't actually using the system day to day. He was more being told by a bunch of people kind of what they wanted and then trying to translate that. So one of the key things is to make sure that the the person who is designing your app, should be a business analyst, someone who's trained on how to understand business workflows and design apps and systems to perform those workflows. That person should be talking directly to the users of the app. And if necessary, they should have multiple meetings with multiple different types of users if there are many different types of users. The more close to the source I, as a business analyst, can go, the better I'm going to be able to understand exactly what they need. Because really, users aren't always able to tell you exactly what they need. A lot of times you'll find out by going in, watching them perform something or watching them do something, and then asking questions. And the thing is there might be a solution that would never occur to the client or the user. Like they know kind of what their problem is and what they're trying to do, but the business analyst can look at them performing that task, ask them some questions, and the business analyst is thinking in their mind, okay, how do I design a solution for this? And they have a lot of experience designing other similar solutions. So they can see patterns and they can see, like, okay, I know how to solve a system like this. Okay, this is let's say it's an onboarding process. Well, I've built a lot of onboarding processes, so I kind of know how they work, right? So the important thing there is to make sure that the right stakeholders are able to communicate with the business analyst. And that can avoid that issue of having, too many people disagreeing about what's needed. Because really, I mean, either you need to choose one person who kind of is going to call the shots on that, or better yet, just give the person who is actually using the app, give them access to the business analyst so they can communicate that clearly.
I agree.
Yeah.
And another point of common conflict I see is the cost versus feature analysis, where there's a tendency to over-engineer solutions. There's perhaps maybe a manual process that the business has that they'd like automated. And there's a question that comes into play. We're automating A and B. They want to automate C, but automating C is going to cost $100,000, but it's only going to save $1,000 a year. And so it's another job of the business analyst is to decide, how can we write the least amount of code? Because less code is better than more code. It's obviously less work to write. It costs less to maintain. It costs less to keep running. And so you need to have somebody with that in the back of their head, where they're thinking the whole time, like, is this the most value that we can deliver here? Or is the manual process something that we should continue with?
Yeah, because that's a huge problem actually with hiring a developer directly. Let's say you go on Upwork and you find a developer and you're just going to hire them directly to build your app, right? Well, if you're a business analyst, then maybe you can do that effectively because you can make those choices and you can design the solution. But really what you need in a business analyst is you need somebody who both understands the business and understands how to learn about a business and how it works, but also they need to be able to communicate technically with developers. They need to be able to understand how things are technically built, because if you talk to somebody and if a typical business owner asks a developer to build, let's say like a form or a certain process, that business owner doesn't know how hard that is to build. The developer doesn't care how hard it is to build, right? So somebody needs to both know how hard it is to build and also know what is important to the business so they can know how worth it is to build that, if that makes sense. So that's really where the business analyst comes in.
Yeah. And I could see, I mean, one of the reasons I asked this question is because, like I mentioned, I've worked at some pretty big companies before. And when you're in an organization with more than 1,000 people, everybody's got ideas and everybody has opinions, and everything's sort of bubbling up the chain, as far as, well, we should be doing this, we should change how we approach this, we should spend more money over here. So do you ever find that you go back to your client or your stakeholders and they say, hey, I know that we spent a lot of time planning this feature, but it's actually not nearly as important as this other thing, and we need to pivot and go a different direction? If that happens, how do you handle that?
I'll tell you how we handle it. The methodology that we use to build software is very different than what you would see when you build a house. And I like to use that analogy because it draws it out real nicely. and helps people understand. When you build a house, you plan the whole thing beforehand, every room down to the millimeter. You know where all the walls are going to be. You know where the kitchen's going to be. You know where everything's at before one brick gets laid. That is not at all how you build software. I mean successful software. That methodology of planning it like a house is what we call waterfall. All of the documentation, all of the architecture is planned upfront before any development begins. This is what you see in a lot of nonprofit applications, government applications, really anything where there's a fixed price. And what ends up happening is business priorities change because businesses change. And so they've created such rigid requirements that the business has changed, but the requirements haven't changed. So then there's like, oh, now we need a change order on this. Now we got to redo all of this work that we already did because we already planned out this feature. Now the business isn't even in that industry anymore, or they're not even selling that service anymore. We got to change that, and it ends up being a big nightmare. I don't know. I mean, we've all used government web applications, and they're horrible. So the right way to build an application is a form of agile methodology, which is where we do the discovery for one feature at a time, or a group of features at a time, and we build those over the course of a couple of weeks, and then we deliver that back into the hands of the stakeholders and say, how about this? And that way, if the stakeholders wake up in the morning and they want to change direction of what services they're going to be offering their clients, or their business processes, or whatever genius idea they have when they wake up that morning, we can immediately get that into development in just a couple of weeks. So the way that you need to think of web applications is they're like living, breathing entities, just like the businesses, and the priorities need to move with the priorities of the business.
Yeah, exactly. When I start doing business analysis with a client, usually what happens is I start talking to them about their project, and they start telling me everything that they want. Hey, we want this whole section to integrate with Google Calendar eventually, and we want a task management system, and we want email notifications also, so that tasks automatically get created when an email comes in or whatever. They're telling me all this stuff they want, right? And so I tell them, okay, that sounds great. We'll put that in the backlog. We'll write that down. Let's just build the calendar first and see how you like that. Not integrated with anything. We take a small piece that is the most valuable. Let's say the calendar is the most important part. Let's just build the calendar and see how your team likes that, how it works for you. So we build the calendar, and they start using it, and they're like, you know what? Actually, we don't need this to integrate with Google Calendar. Let's actually put our focus somewhere else. And so every time we deliver a sprint, it's possible for the client's whole list to kind of shift around and change.
Because next thing you know, they're no longer using Google Calendar. We had plans to integrate with Google Calendar, but then they found a better calendar online they want to integrate with.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So do little pieces at a time. Don't worry about trying to even plan most of the app up front, because it's all going to change. Just do one sprint, which is usually around 40 to 60 hours of work or something in that. It could be 10 to 20, but basically just do one sprint first and let the client actually use that software, get their hands on it and actually experience it. And then they'll discover what they want in the next sprint. And then they'll use that, and then they'll discover what they want in the next sprint. And it kind of goes on like that in an iterative process. And it prevents the situation of us spending 500 hours building an app, giving it to the client, and it's not at all what they were expecting, and they don't like it, basically. So that's why Agile is so important.
Yeah, taking it back to the example of comparing it to building a house. It'd be like, building a room, living in it for a little bit, see how you like it.
Yeah.
Probably not the best methodology for a house. So yeah, I like it. So you're taking an agile approach, you're getting to know their needs, and it sounds like you're kind of gathering user feedback while you're still building. You're releasing features pretty quickly and having them test out certain features. Um, how do you enable user feedback? Do you just, ask your stakeholders or ask your point of contact at the company to ask their employees, or how does that process look?
Well, there's a few different ways of doing it. And first, I want to touch on something you said before. So basically building one room of a house, right, and trying to live in it.
Yeah.
That brings up a great point, because the thing about software, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a unit, one sprint that you can do that when it's finished, it will provide value on its own, right? So with a house, one room is not going to provide value on its own, because if you don't have this wall up and the rain's coming in, it's like it's not going to do you any good, right? But with software, you can go one sprint at a time, and each sprint provides its own value. That's why businesses like Agile so much, because after 2 weeks, they have working software that they actually can use, and that they can start saving money, and they can start being more efficient right away. So that's kind of why software is a little different than building a house, because you can provide those units of value. So in order to do that, it's key to get the feedback on each sprint after it's done. So to do that, nothing replaces face-to-face communication. So really, we get on Zoom calls with our clients. We show them the software. They share their screen. They actually start using it. They give us direct feedback like that. Usually the client, like, they have access to the app throughout the entire process. So there's a staging environment. They log on whenever they want to and see how it's looking. And then as they start using it, they'll maybe come up with a few changes, or they can send us a Slack message. They can send us an email, however they want to communicate that. We also have software in the apps that, like a little feedback button that they can send in a ticket right there. So they can put in, if they find a bug or something they don't like, they can put in a ticket, and it goes straight into our system so that we can start working on it. So there's a few different ways. There's also automated ways of actually finding bugs in the apps, even if the client doesn't even notice them.
I mean, yeah, there's a whole array of tools that could be used for that. There's performance monitoring, there's telemetry, there's uptime monitoring, transactional monitoring, just a whole bunch of different monitor software. Basically, the gist is you can measure all of these different things. And if you see something that goes outside of the parameters that you want, then you can put that in as something to investigate. And it's really important, especially if you want the software that you build to work long term and be reliable.
So we've got some features built. We've got users testing and actively using these features. Do you ever find that people struggle to figure out how to use a new system, or how do you approach the change management process? Is there any sort of documentation that you need to send along with your new application that sort of walks people through it, or how do you approach that?
Well, there's always training that you need. Like, at least a lot of times there's training. So when an application is finished, someone's going to need to train the team on how to use it. Sometimes we provide videos. Like for one of our clients, I make the videos myself. I just go in and sort of make a tutorial video on how to use a certain part of the app and send that over to her, and she puts it on their YouTube channel. Some other options are, basically you can have a big meeting on Zoom where you can kind of show everyone the app and everyone can ask questions. So it's important to make sure everyone on the team has a chance to use the app and give their feedback. But as far as user experience goes, that's one of the important parts of designing a web app and building it, is to make sure that as you're going, you design it in a way to make sure that the person using it it's going to be intuitive for them, right? So that is another reason why you want to have a business analyst, because developers, what they usually do is they will build it in the way that makes sense to them. And since they're writing the code, they have a very different view on that feature. To them, it makes, like, they're thinking algorithmically, they're thinking about how it works under the hood. So when they're using it, they may build it in a really wonky way, but to them, it makes total sense, right? That's why you have to have someone who's thinking from the perspective of the business owner or the app user. Like, okay, how do I want this to work? What would be the most convenient way for this to work? That's where you can also do mock-ups and things like that, so that you can make sure that you design it up front, so that it's going to be really user-friendly. And UX UI is a whole field in and of itself, that's important to incorporate when you're designing an app that your team's going to use.
Mhm.
Yeah, the training really is based on the context of there's a lot of context to consider. How many users, if it's a handful of users, less than 100, maybe one Zoom call can work. But it also depends on how drastic the change is. If it's just like a label change or something like that, you might be able to roll it out without any additional training. And then it also depends on who the user is. So there's a lot to consider here. And that's why it's always a conversation. The decisions aren't something that we just decide. They're a conversation we have with the client to say, hey, this feature is pretty impactful and that we made a lot of sweeping changes here. How do we need to train the team? Like, is this something where you think that the team can just handle it? Can we just roll it out and, all of your users are going to be fine because they're all very technically inclined? Or are they all non-technically inclined and we need to, maybe put it through a review and watch some people use it and see what challenges they have and then go back and iterate on those challenges. And at the end of the day, it's really just a conversation with with the stakeholders and a good understanding of the users in order to answer the question of what the training needs to look like particularly.
Yeah. Like I imagine most of that is probably handled on the client side. It's their job to train their employees. It's their job to make sure that they know what their objectives are and they're getting them done. But I imagine it's a big piece of how effective a solution is do people actually adopt the solution? Are they actually using it? And yeah, a big part of that is just telling them about it and then telling them again. And then a week later, tell them again. So,
Mhm. Once you
well,
get tired
cool.
of saying it, your team is starting to hear it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a big piece of any time you're trying to make an operational improvement is the change management, the follow up, the training that goes into actually getting people to change their habits around the processes that they've already got.
Yeah,
Um,
usually what we do for that, David, is we try to make it so that the new system is such a massive improvement to the old system that they don't even think of the old system anymore.
mhm.
For example, we move somebody off of spreadsheets to the new system, and it's just so much easier for them to use that they're not even thinking about it.
Well, cool. So tell me a little bit more about the considerations that you have to bring up with your clients. I know data security is a pretty big deal. How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, well, from the technical side, well, I guess to take a step back from the business analyst side, we need to understand what the data is. Is it health information? Are we going to be storing credit cards? Is the data even sensitive at all? Like these are questions that Calvin would ask, but then they would be relayed to me, and I would come up with the technical solution. For example, Calvin says, "Hey, this is PHI for a medical application." Okay, well, now I need to focus on how do we set this application up to be HIPAA? What are the considerations there? Okay, well, in order to be HIPAA, we need data encryption in transit, we need data encryption at rest, um, and there's certain data encryption algorithms that we have to use. We have to use HTTPS, which we use anyway for all the applications, but it is a requirement. We need to set up session management where it'll automatically log people out. Like there's just knowing that health information needs to be stored will completely change the architecture of the project versus Calvin says, oh yeah, actually this data, it can be public. So it all starts there. And then from there, we can decide what's the risk. Depending on what the risk is, will determine the technical architecture. Do we need backups? Do we need pen tests? What are the consequences if something goes wrong? Will somebody die? Those things um, those questions have to be answered for us to get a really good idea on what we're going to build.
Another related aspect of, I mean, it's not really secure, like external security, but when we're building a web application, one of the important things to think about with each sprint is feature release management, which basically is how are we going to control this new feature if there are already a bunch of users on the app and they're using it. If we build a new feature that's going to impact them, how do we roll it out in a way that's not going to disrupt them? And how do we make sure that while it's getting built and tested, it's actually not something that they can interact with, and it's not something that can break what they're currently using? So we have various tools for that. Usually it's up to the business analyst to define how feature release management is going to work for each project, because if the project is brand new and there's no one using the app, there's no need to put everything behind a bunch of flags or put it like secure everything from the end user, because there is no end user yet. But if there's 1,000 users relying on the app, then it becomes very important to have feature flags, which are basically pieces of code that allow one person or a group of people, like developers, to see a new feature and hides that feature from everyone else. Or maybe we have to think about, okay, did the database change? Because if we made database changes, those need to be made in a backwards compatible way so that we can roll that change out without turning on those flags. And then we can turn those flags on slowly, maybe to a certain percentage of the user base, so that we can roll that feature out gradually. And if we're building, sometimes we do build on platforms like Knack that lack some of those features, where, if you make a change to a Knack application, which is a low-code app, it's going to be live right away. So that's where we have actually built certain tools that actually give us version control in those apps. We have some proprietary frameworks that allow us to have that. We also use rule-based controls where, on a certain page, like if you are a developer, you can see that page. If you're not, you can't. So feature release management is also important to consider. And it's something that actually is not just a developer job. The business analyst needs to actually design and understand what are the requirements for how this feature needs to be released in a way that's not going to disrupt users. And then after those requirements are specified, then I need to share that with the development team so they can design it in that way and make sure while they're building it that they adhere to those standards.
Yeah, and on top of that, one of the biggest pitfalls that we see when people bring in developers in-house or they hire an individual developer, and maybe we'll get into the pros and cons of hiring an agency versus hiring in-house developers. But one of the things that we see all the time is there's a lack of consideration around security. And then there's also a lack of consideration on how they're going to roll out the new features to the users.
Makes sense.
Because as an agency, we need to deal with that, not just with one project, not just with one client, but with many clients. So we have to have a very good system in place in order to handle that and make sure that for every project we have, no matter what developers are working on it, no matter who the project manager for that is, that system allows us to have full control over those features and over security and over how they're released. So that's one of the big benefits of having a full stack agency, a full team that has the different skill sets that are required to pull that off.
Yeah. And I wouldn't expect any one of my engineers to be able to do all that security work or all the architecture planning. That's why you need a variety of different skills to build a web application generally. You can't just, like, there are circumstances where you could get by with just hiring a developer, a couple developers to build your application. And maybe we'll get into that. But generally speaking, for enterprise or applications that your business is going to be running on, it's probably a good idea to get a team of people.
So what are the pros and cons of, hiring your own internal engineers versus hiring a firm?
Yeah, well, let's first define what that even means, right? Like, what does it mean to hire in-house versus what does it mean to outsource? Because you can outsource and just hire one developer, and you could also outsource to like a nearshore or offshore agency. So I think you can kind of say, all right, you can in-house and bring in an entire team of experts like we have here at Ksense, where you're bringing in a business analyst, you're bringing in a product owner, you're bringing in several engineers, DevOps specialist, and then there's the outsourcing where you could contract all those people and work with an external agency who already has those. I think that that's kind of really the two options in terms of what's going to give you the most success. Or your application could be handled by one or two engineers if the application doesn't need all of that level of expertise, right? Like I would, if there's like an integration, this app needs to talk with another app, and somebody came to me and said, "Hey, Kelson, do you think that I should hire an agency to do this, or should I hire one developer?" I'd say, "Okay, well, what are the consequences of this going wrong? What's your budget look like?" And if they told me, "Oh, well, if it goes wrong, it's fine. Like, there's no big deal," then I'd say, "Okay, well, maybe you have a low budget. Go hire somebody offshore to build this for you, and if it's not done really well, you can try to find somebody else." But if they come to me and say, "Hey, I need like a massive system, it's going to I'm going to run my whole business off of this," then they really have the two options. So they can bring a team in-house, or they can outsource to a team, right? I don't think there's I would completely get rid of the idea of being able to just hire one or two engineers, bring them onto your team and manage them yourself, unless you're highly technical yourself. It's just generally a bad idea. It's really like nothing about cars, and you want to manage a bunch of mechanics. Like, you're not going to know how long anything takes. You're not going to know how much any of the parts cost. Like, you're just going to hope that they're going to do a good job, and that's kind of the same situation that certain people find themselves in when they go out and they hire their own software engineers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what people will, or what businesses will often do is they'll have to get a CTO, so a chief technology officer that actually has those skills, that not only has the skills but has experience actually managing developers, actually going out and finding the right skill sets to bring people in, contractors or whatnot. So I guess with an agency, what you kind of get is you kind of get a CTO team. Like the people at the agency, if there's a software development agency who does good work and they have a good process for building web applications, there is one or more CTO level developers or CTO level people at that agency. So really, if you have a CTO in your organization and that person can go out and hire the talent they need, that's great. You could probably do that successfully. Or you can go get an agency and you're basically getting the CTO, you're getting the developers, you're getting the business analysts, and you're getting the whole, full service sort of agency that has all those skills. And all you need to bring to the table is your knowledge about the business and your requirements and what you need. And then they're going to help you communicate what you need and design it and get it built, basically.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense to bring in an in-house team when there's security or IP, considerations. Like, this data, if it gets out, it's going to ruin our business. Or this IP, if it gets out, our competitors are going to have an advantage against us. Like, those are some considerations. Also, the CTO has the bandwidth to manage that team. I think it could make a lot of sense to bring in their own team. You have a lot more control of whether you have a lot more control than hiring an agency than a lot of times you do when you hire an agency. But the benefits to hiring an agency really is that you just have a much better communication process. You don't have to worry about the translation of a vision to the actual code. That's kind of handled for you. A lot of times, you have the ability to change direction a little bit more quickly, maybe. You can leverage special knowledge. You don't have to bring on a DevOps engineer onto your team when they're very expensive just for a few hours of work. Rather, you can hire an agency and they already have that because they're doing many projects at a time. And then a lot of times you might save money by outsourcing, especially if you go like nearshore, offshore, because you don't have to pay the higher salaries. And a lot of times I'd say you can probably save money by building in the US because you also don't have to pay all the salaries and taxes and everything like that as well.
Sometimes with an agency, you do have actually an easier ability to budget your web application, because a lot of agencies have a process for actually providing an estimate for how long something's going to take and how much it's going to cost. An internal team, they're just going to keep working on it, month after month. And the efficiency of the project is determined by the quality level of the people on that team, right? With the agency, they're going to come to you and say, hey, here's our proposal. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's, how long it's going to take, we think. And you can kind of hold them to that commitment in a way. Now, I would stay away from fixed pricing, because a lot of times what will happen with fixed pricing is the agencies just really jacking up the price, because they're trying to, like, if they're going to charge you a fixed price, they're taking all the risk on, right? They're going to take all that risk that and they know that things can go wrong and things can change. So that means they're going to have to really raise that price to make up for that, right? So I would stay away from that, but it is nice with an agency to be able to get at least an estimate on each sprint that you're doing, because then you can actually control the budget and control kind of how many resources you're having to put into it.
Yeah, and you're not. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, and you're also not paying a full salary even when you're not using those engineers on a particular part of a project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the agency also has processes on how to do things more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
It's in our best interest to provide the most value to our clients. It's not always in the best interest of the developers to work as quickly and efficiently as they possibly can. Sometimes it's in their best interest to not do so. And so, yeah, we find that a lot of people prefer the agency approach when they don't want to manage a big team and all the hassle that goes along with that. They also want to have things maybe done a little bit faster, and they don't want to have to worry about the salaries and trying to hire, which can be week-long processes, or month-long processes, depending on who you're trying to hire. So yeah, that's what we see a lot of times. I'd like to maybe touch on a little bit, if you're going to pick an agency, the differences that you'll get from US based versus offshore, and when I've seen those work. So we've never been able to successfully have the same quality of a product whenever we tried, years in the past to hire offshore and, an offshore team, just because there's always some differences in culture, and especially because the documentation all comes out in English, the tutorials come out in English, and so it takes a little bit of time for that to maybe get translated to the other languages. It's already hard enough with the communication between the stakeholders and the developers. And we found that it's even more difficult when there's a language barrier. Add time zones into the mix, and we just decided that it was a little bit too much of a hassle for us to take on. I have heard of situations where it has worked, where a team was able to save a lot of money by hiring an offshore team, but I've only heard of it. I've never actually seen it myself. The only thing that I've seen is these, projects limping into us that have been very poorly built from offshore teams. So I don't want to smash on too hard, but I've never seen it work very well. And I'm assuming that if it does work well, they're highly managed by somebody that's very technical.
Yeah. Some of the things to look for when hiring an agency, I would say. So, like, if you want to make sure that the agency is going to do a good job for you, one thing I would try to make sure of is that you know who at that agency is going to be responsible for your success. So one thing that tends to happen in some agencies is that there's somebody who, there's some really good people at the agency, but they are not responsible for the success of the clients. They may help in managing projects, and they may move from one to another and not really come back to this one for a while. So what you really want is you want somebody at that organization who is going to advocate for your project and make sure that it's a priority. Somebody who is going to stick with your project long term and really get invested in it. Because when somebody has when someone is invested in a project, they tend to really care whether it goes right or wrong. Like for some of the projects I manage, I am a lot of times like going out of my way to make sure that certain things get done on time. And it's because I've been with that client for over a year and I really care if that project goes well. So like you want to try to make sure that someone is taking full responsibility for your project and that who at that organization is that person that they're responsible for the success of the project. And I would also make sure that the people that are managing the project are at the level that you're looking for in terms of the business analysis and also the development. So it's easier to see in terms of the business analysis because it's kind of hard to know how good of a development team is, especially if you're not able to look at their code and kind of see what the result is. But as far as the business analyst side, you shouldn't be having a difficult or frustrating time being able to tell them what you want and for them to understand you. So if you start to tell them what you're looking for and you just feel like they don't get it, they don't understand, and they're not able to share your vision and lay that out in a clear way, that business analyst may not be at the right level to do a really good job for your project. So usually it's good, like if you start seeing that, if you try to hire an agency, you start seeing that, okay, this person's like a junior project manager. They're not really qualified to design a web application. Like I'm telling them what I want and they don't know the right questions to ask. And I could just tell, hey, they don't really understand what I want, like my vision. It's a good idea at that point to either see if you can get somebody on that's working on your project that knows what they're doing, or maybe look for a different agency. So that would be my tip for how to try to find a good agency.
Yeah, I can help a little bit with how to make sure they're technically able. The first thing that I would do is ask them what technologies they're using and then go look up when those technologies were released. Because if they're using technologies that were released in the 90s, they're probably not delivering the value that they could potentially be delivering if they were building something that's more modern. We have a lot of really new tools that are really fast and speed up development a lot. And we see that there's still a lot of agencies that are lagging behind. They're using really old tools and solutions because that's what they're comfortable with. That's what they're familiar with. That's what they've always used. So that's the first thing that I would do is say, all right, what technologies are you wanting to use?
What's an example of one that would be like, ooh, that's an old piece of tech?
Oh, I mean, I would say access databases are probably as bad as you can go. Like people that are building those today, that's just a really bad decision. Code Igniter, I would say, is pretty old. There's some people that would advocate more probably. Ruby on Rails. Yeah, I mean, PHP is there. There's still a lot of modern solutions around PHP. I wouldn't say to completely stay away from it, but I prefer not to build in PHP just because then you need your whole team knowing multiple programming languages. And unless absolutely required, I try to stay away from that. I don't like buying into any of the Microsoft technology. There's a lot of overhead in terms of licensing and stuff like that. So I try to stay away from C# and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say that you should 100% stay away from those things. Just get kind of the blueprint on how the team plans to build your application. Go look up some of those tools and ask them clearly, like, why are we using this? Look up some of the modern options and say, all right, why are we using this compared to this modern option? And nowadays we have a really good AI with ChatGPT. Like go ask it like, hey, how does this are there technologies that are better than this technology? Like, should we really be using jQuery to build this application? Ask it that, and it's going to tell you no. And then you can go back to them and say, all right, look, I've heard that jQuery really isn't a great solution today in 2024. Like, what are we doing here? But yeah, you'll find that that's a really good way, even though you can't evaluate how good their code is going to be, knowing the architecture decisions and kind of evaluating those yourself and maybe pressing back a little bit will give you a lot of information on how good of an agency they are. We try to use tools that, are brand new, like they didn't come out yesterday, because those often have a lot of problems. But we want tools that can come out in the last, in web development, things move very quickly, but last year or 2 years, we try to always stay on one of the long-term support versions of whatever software we're using. And then we choose our technology not just based on how fast it is, or what the developer experience is like, but also how large is the community? Like, if there's no community around this new piece of technology, then what do you do if you have a problem? So there's a lot of technical considerations that really need to be evaluated one by one in order to pick the right technology. But I think there's a good argument that if you're using technology that's more than 5 years old, you're probably you're probably making a misstep.
Yeah, at least with web development, right? Like web development, there's just so many options out there that are brand new and that have solved big problems with older technologies.
I'd say it might even be a red flag if it's like over 3 years old in this industry, if you're building a web app. I'm not talking about the latest release of the technology. Like React is obviously more than 3 years old, but if they're using a version that's, when it first came out, then that's the problem, right? If that's what they want to use. And then, scalability, like can it handle the scale you want? And I don't know. There's a lot of a lot of questions, but yeah, I would try to challenge them on some of those points and see. Otherwise, you'll end up getting a really poorly built application, or maybe it's not poorly built, but it just takes forever to build because a lot of the older tools just took a lot longer to build stuff with.
Another thing is like, look at the agency you're planning to hire and ask yourself, what do they specialize in? What do they do exactly? Do they just do mainly mobile apps but they are willing to do a desktop app? Or, like if you want to build a certain type of app on a certain platform or for a certain use case, you should try to find an agency that specializes and that has a lot of experience doing that, because, they could be really good at mobile apps, but if they don't have a good process around desktop apps or around web apps, then they could, even though they're good at mobile apps, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good at a completely different type of product, right?
Yeah,
that's right. And if they do everything, everything under the sun, it means that they probably don't do anything very well.
Right.
Yeah, and then the other thing that is really important to consider is just how good it feels. Like, do they feel like a good cultural fit with your organization? Do you feel like they're capable of handling the job? Are they going to come in? Are they going to meet your budget? Things like that are also really important to consider.
And if you're asking like the person who's the technical expert on the team or whatever, and you're trying to inquire about their technology choices, a good sign that they're maybe not a great fit is if they're uncomfortable sort of talking about it. Because a lot of times, like if you have somebody who, this is what they do, they're working or they either working at or own a web development agency, and they're in charge of selecting the technology, they're probably very passionate and have a lot of knowledge about what technology to select, and they will have no problem going in depth with you about it and telling you all about it. If they're uncomfortable talking about the subject, maybe that's a red flag.
Yeah, and if they are uncomfortable, it's usually just because of the fact that they're familiar with certain technologies and they don't really like to, they're really familiar with it, so they like to do what they know instead of learning what would be better for you, right? Like there's a lot of developers that they've been doing the same thing for 10 years. They've been using the same technologies for 10 years, and they don't even realize that, that ship has sailed. Nobody even uses that anymore. So when you come to them and say, hey, I need this software built, they immediately go to the thing they know and the thing that they're confident in. And they have no ideas. They have no idea that all this new great technology is now being used that gets rid of all the problems that they're having to manually solve in their old system. It allows them to build 30% faster and have a much better development experience. They don't even know that that stuff exists. We try really hard to make sure that we're keeping up with the times, making sure we know all the new technologies, the new AI solutions, the new, all the new things that are coming out so that we can build as fast and deliver as much value as possible. And we're never choosing a technology because it's what we've used in the past. It's not a good enough reason. We choose technologies based on what will solve the problem the best.
Well, it's a lot of really great tips, a lot of value-packed info. Is there anything that you guys would add as far as just our broader topic as a final tip to people who are looking to develop a web application or looking to hire somebody to develop one for them? Any general considerations or tips?
I would say make sure that you have a good idea or a good vision for what the problems are that you're trying to solve. It can be a big problem if you go into it and you really don't know you don't know why you want to build this app, you don't know, you just know, hey, we need to have a better app. Let's just try to build a better app. But if you don't know, here are the problems we're trying to solve, right? What are our pain points? You don't need to know how to solve them. You don't need to know how to design it. That's what the business analyst is for. But you should know exactly what problems you're trying to solve and have a vision for what the end result is going to be. And if you have that, a good agency should be able to steer you in the right direction and design a good solution for you.
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice would be to plan as much at the beginning of the project. Don't get too excited to start development, even though development is very exciting. But make sure you've done your due diligence. What is the minimal viable product for this? How soon can I see returns off of this work? Is there anything we can cut from the MVP to slim it down? Is there anything we can add to it to provide more value? Where are the milestones in the project? Where are those going to be? But yeah, forefront as much planning as you can. And like Calvin said, really have a good idea of how it's going to solve your pain points, because the planning's useless if you don't know that. But then start development only once you have those milestones in place. And try to get working software in your hands as quickly as you can.